I was just finishing up dinner when I heard the sound of tires screeching in front of my driveway. By the time I stepped outside, my tractor was already surrounded, 2 HOA board members and one furious woman with her phone angled like she was filming the climax of some courtroom drama. "That machine," she barked, pointing at my John Deere like it had personally insulted her, "is a violation of community standards. I'm reporting it right now." The absurdity nearly made me laugh, because the tractor wasn't even parked on the street. It was in my own yard, tucked neatly beside the barn, 100 feet back from the curb. But she stood there, hair perfectly sprayed into an armored helmet, lips trembling with self-righteousness, determined to turn my equipment into a crime scene. Her voice carried down the block, drawing out curious neighbors. The HOA president adjusted his glasses and muttered something about bylaws, while she began scrolling furiously through her phone to summon the proper authorities. I kept my arms crossed, calm, half amused, half irritated, watching her stumble over her own outrage. That's when she snapped her head toward me and shouted, "This entire neighborhood has property values to protect. We can't have people like you cluttering it with farm junk." The irony was delicious. My property stretched over 5 acres, complete with stables, fencing, and a barn that had been here decades before the HOA even existed. Still, she treated it like I'd dropped a rusty washing machine on the lawn just to spite her. I could feel the crowd leaning in. Some were grinning, others looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Karen, though I hadn't yet decided she truly earned the title, kept escalating. "If you don't move that tractor by tonight," she declared, "I will personally see that the sheriff tows it away." Don't test me. That line did it. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing outright. She genuinely thought a sheriff's deputy was going to hitch up my tractor like an abandoned sedan. I gave her a slow smile and said, "Well, if you call the sheriff, I hope you've got enough fence insurance." That earned me puzzled looks, but I didn't explain. The woman's cheeks flushed scarlet, whether from anger or confusion I couldn't tell. She spun back toward the HOA men, demanding they write me up, demanding citations that didn't exist, demanding control. I knew then that this was only the opening volley. She wanted a fight, and she was going to get one. That night, I called a buddy of mine, Deputy Harris, who had grown up 2 streets over and now wore a badge in our county. I explained the situation, and he let out a long whistle. "She really threatened to call us out for a tractor," he said. "Oh, I hope she does. I'll personally take the case." His chuckle was deep, promising, the kind of sound that told me this story wasn't going to end quietly. Sure enough, the next morning I spotted Karen pacing by the HOA clubhouse with her phone pressed to her ear. Within the hour, a sheriff's cruiser rolled into the neighborhood, lights flicking once as if to announce its arrival. Karen marched toward it like she'd summoned divine judgment, dragging the president and vice president of the HOA behind her. I leaned against my fence, sipping coffee, and waited. When Harris stepped out, he was all professionalism at first. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" She gestured furiously toward my yard. "That tractor is a blight on our neighborhood. It violates standards, it's dangerous, it lowers values. You need to tow it immediately." Harris turned his eyes toward me, one eyebrow rising just enough that I knew he was already enjoying himself. "Ma'am," he said, "that's his private property. A tractor is farm equipment, not an abandoned vehicle. We don't tow those." Karen's face crumpled, then reassembled itself with more fire. She jabbed a finger toward my land. "Then drive it out of here. You have the authority, don't you?" Harris scratched his chin, then tilted his head at me. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I could drive it, but only if the property owner allows it." The silence that fell over the HOA members was thick enough to cut. I raised my mug in a mock toast and said, "Sheriff, keys are in the ignition." Karen's jaw nearly hit the pavement. Harris grinned like a kid on Christmas morning, walked over, and climbed into the tractor. The engine roared to life, echoing off every polished vinyl siding house in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors poured out of their front doors as the sheriff backed the tractor out, gears grinding with authority. Karen shrieked, stumbling backward as Harris spun the wheel and drove it right through the flimsy wooden fence that separated my pasture from the HOA greenbelt. Boards cracked, splinters flew, and Karen wailed like he'd run over her dog. Harris leaned out the window and called, "Fence looks like it needed replacing anyway." By then, half the neighborhood was laughing openly. Karen's outrage had detonated spectacularly, backfiring in a way I couldn't have planned better myself. But as satisfying as the scene was, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to double down, to escalate. And the HOA men standing beside her looked nervous enough to know they'd just been roped into something far bigger than a tractor dispute. I watched her gather herself, trembling, face twisted with fury. She pointed at me and screamed, "This isn't finished. You'll regret humiliating me." The sheriff shut off the tractor and climbed down, giving me a subtle wink before walking back to his cruiser. I knew in that moment the battle lines had been drawn. Karen wasn't just annoyed anymore, she was obsessed. And obsessed people don't quit. What I didn't know then was just how far she would go. This was no longer about a tractor, or a fence, or bylaws. This was about control, about power, about her need to dominate everyone around her. And she had just learned I wasn't someone she could control, which meant the war had only begun. By the following weekend, Karen had escalated her campaign into something resembling a military operation. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of pounding, not on my door, but on wooden stakes being hammered into my front yard. When I walked outside, bleary-eyed with a mug of coffee in hand, I found a row of bright orange violation notice signs planted like angry sunflowers across my grass. Each bore the HOA's logo at the top, followed by a long, self-important paragraph declaring my tractor to be an unauthorized structure detrimental to community aesthetic harmony. I read one of them out loud just to hear how ridiculous it sounded, then laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Karen was standing at the curb with her arms crossed, her lips pursed into a straight line. She had clearly supervised this little project, her manicured finger probably pointing to each exact spot where a stake should go. "Remove your tractor by Monday," she said flatly, "or we'll remove it for you." Her entourage, 2 board members and her husband, who looked like he'd rather be golfing, nodded silently, though none of them made eye contact with me. I crouched down and tugged one of the signs out of the soil. It came free without resistance, wobbling like a bad prop. "This is interesting," I said. "Looks official. Did you get the sheriff to sign these, or just your nail salon?" Karen flushed crimson, but instead of answering, she whipped out her phone and snapped a picture of me holding the sign, as though that would serve as evidence in some imagined trial. By the time Monday rolled around, the signs were still in place. I hadn't touched the rest of them because, frankly, they amused me. But Karen took that as defiance. When I came home from work that evening, I found she'd gone further. The HOA had taped a final warning letter to my front door. It claimed that the board had voted unanimously to fine me $500 a day until the tractor was removed. The absurdity made me chuckle, but underneath the humor was a spark of anger. This was no longer about annoyance. This was a full-on attempt to bleed me dry until I surrendered. I drafted a letter of my own, calm, polite, dripping with sarcasm, and dropped it off at the HOA mailbox. I explained that my property predated their covenant, that my tractor was legal farm equipment, and that their fines had no legal basis. Then, just to twist the knife, I included a line offering to rent the tractor to the HOA for discounted lawn care. I knew it would infuriate Karen, and it did. By Tuesday morning, she was stomping across my driveway, demanding to speak to me in front of the neighbors who had gathered to watch. "You think this is funny?" she barked, waving my letter like a smoking gun. "You're mocking the entire community." "Not the entire community," I replied smoothly. "Just the part that thinks it can outlaw tractors on farmland." The crowd chuckled. Karen's face twitched. She wasn't used to being the butt of the joke. That afternoon, I got a call from Deputy Harris. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice shaking with amusement. "She actually came down to the station and tried to file a complaint against you. Claimed you were running an unlicensed heavy machinery depot in a residential neighborhood." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Harris chuckled. "I told her if she wanted me to confiscate your tractor, she'd need to prove it was stolen. And then she accused me of being in your pocket." The situation was spiraling, but not in the direction Karen wanted. Every attempt to paint me as a menace only made her look more unhinged. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. People like Karen thrive on escalation. If she couldn't win with fines or fake notices, she'd find a new angle. And she did. That Friday, I came home to find a group of contractors unloading supplies in front of my pasture. Rolls of chain-link fencing, posts, and a cement mixer sat on the grass. When I asked what they were doing, one of them shrugged. "We've been hired to build a privacy barrier between your lot and the HOA Greenbelt. Orders from the association." I looked over to see Karen perched on her porch like a queen overseeing her dominion, sipping from a wine glass and smirking. I marched over. "You can't build on my property." She tilted her head. "It's not your property. That fence line has always been disputed. We're just claiming what's rightfully part of the association's land." My jaw tightened. The fence line she was pointing at had been established decades ago, verified in every deed and county record. But I could see what she was doing, moving the battlefield. If she couldn't remove the tractor, she'd box it in. I phoned Harris again, and within an hour he was on site. He walked the property line, consulted the county records, and shook his head. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "this land belongs to him. If you set so much as a post an inch past this marker, you're trespassing." Karen tried to argue, her voice rising in pitch and volume, but Harris wasn't swayed. Finally, in exasperation, she snapped, "Fine. But we'll see what the county zoning board has to say about it." She stormed off, leaving the contractors awkwardly packing up their gear. I offered them some lemonade before they left, and one of them muttered, "Man, she's a piece of work." For a brief moment I thought maybe that would slow her down. But I was wrong. The following week, I received a letter, not from the HOA this time, but from the county zoning office. It was a formal complaint, filed anonymously, alleging that I was operating commercial farming equipment in a residential zone. Karen had finally found a lever outside the HOA. I had to attend a hearing downtown, where Karen showed up dressed like she was attending a funeral, complete with a black hat and pearls. She gave a dramatic testimony about how my industrial machinery was endangering children, lowering property values, and destroying the tranquility of the neighborhood. I sat quietly, letting her dig her own hole. Then, when it was my turn, I produced every deed, zoning map, and permit proving my property was grandfathered in as agricultural use. The zoning board deliberated for less than 5 minutes before dismissing the complaint entirely. Karen's face was priceless. She had come expecting victory and left humiliated. But as we filed out of the chamber, she leaned close to me and whispered, "This isn't about tractors anymore. This is about who runs this neighborhood. And it won't be you." That was the moment I realized we were no longer fighting a skirmish. This was war, and she was willing to scorch the earth to win. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People were picking sides. Some thought Karen was unhinged, others admired her dedication to standards. I stayed calm, outwardly unbothered, but inside I was bracing. Because I knew Karen's obsession hadn't reached its peak yet. She wasn't just coming for the tractor. She was coming for me. And when people like her reach that point, they stop caring about rules entirely. They start playing dirty. Which meant the real fight was just around the corner. Neighborhood simmering like a pot just shy of boiling. Everywhere I went, whether walking the dog, hauling hay to the barn, or picking up mail, I noticed curtains twitching and whispers cutting off as I passed. Karen had transformed the tractor dispute into a morality play, and she had cast herself as Joan of Arc defending the sacred values of suburban order. I was, in her telling, the villain, a crude landowner dragging the neighborhood into chaos with my farmyard toys. It might have been laughable if it hadn't carried real consequences. The next escalation arrived in the form of paper, dozens of them, fluttering like dead leaves across the street one morning. Flyers, printed on neon yellow, plastered mailboxes, doors, and lampposts. Each one carried a dramatic title in bold block letters. Is our community safe with heavy machinery in our midst? Below that was a grainy photo of my tractor, zoomed in so aggressively it looked like a monster from a bad horror film. The text listed dangers, ranging from toxic emissions to potential child injury. There was even a bullet point about noise pollution, which was ironic since I hadn't turned the tractor on in weeks. I gathered a handful of flyers and stood at the corner while neighbors eyed me warily. Some chuckled and rolled their eyes, others looked genuinely nervous. That was Karen's genius. She knew that if you shout danger often enough, people start believing it's real. I could practically feel her watching from behind her blinds, waiting for me to lose my temper. But I didn't. I calmly stuffed the flyers into my back pocket and went about my chores. Losing my cool was exactly what she wanted, and I refused to give her that satisfaction. That evening, however, things escalated again. A small convoy of SUVs and minivans pulled into my driveway, their headlights cutting across the pasture like searchlights. A delegation of HOA members spilled out, clutching clipboards and muttering amongst themselves. At their head, of course, was Karen, flanked like a general inspecting her troops. She marched up to my porch and announced, loud enough for the entire block to hear, "We are conducting a safety inspection. Refusal to comply will be considered obstruction of HOA authority." I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, and raised an eyebrow. Safety inspection? Is this before or after the parade? The HOA vice president, a timid man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. It's within our rights to inspect potential hazards." "Hazards?" I said. "You mean the tractor? The one that's locked, parked, and sitting quietly on private property?" Karen jabbed a manicured finger at me. "This is not just about you. It's about protecting children, families, and property values. You are selfishly endangering everyone here." I let the silence hang, letting the crowd of neighbors who had gathered soak it in. Finally, I replied, "If you step 1 foot onto my land without a warrant, you'll be the only hazard around here." My voice was calm, even, but the steel in it was unmistakable. The crowd murmured. Karen's eyes flashed, but she pulled back. She wasn't ready to test me yet. They left after a few more empty threats, but the damage was done. Karen had staged her spectacle, rallying the fearful and the gossip-hungry. And I could see the lines hardening. Some neighbors gave me sympathetic nods, others avoided me altogether, as though proximity to the tractor menace might taint them. The following week brought the next twist. A petition. Karen went door to door with her ever-present clipboard, gathering signatures for a resolution to have my tractor declared a public nuisance. I heard her spiel secondhand from one of the few neighbors who liked me enough to tell me the truth. She described it with the kind of passion usually reserved for campaign rallies, how my tractor was lowering home values, scaring children, and bringing in undesirable elements. When pressed for evidence, she apparently waved her phone around, showing photos she'd snapped at odd angles to make the tractor look menacing. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, she had enough signatures to bring it to a vote. I decided to attend. Not because I respected the process, but because I wanted to look her in the eye while she tried to strip away my rights. The clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs lined every wall, and the air buzzed with tension. Karen stood at the front like a preacher at revival, waving her petition in the air. "This is not personal," she declared, her voice trembling with righteous fury. This is about the safety and dignity of our community. We cannot allow one man's stubbornness to ruin what we've all built here." The crowd clapped politely, some with real conviction, others just to avoid conflict. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, hands in my pockets, scanning the room. "You know," I said, "it's funny how this tractor never bothered anyone until Karen decided it was her personal crusade. It doesn't block roads. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't lower property values, unless you're planning to sell your house to someone who faints at the sight of tires. This isn't about safety. It's about control. About one person trying to dictate how the rest of us live." The room erupted into chatter. Some nodded, some scowled. Karen pounded the podium for order, but the board chair finally called for a vote. The resolution failed, barely. Just 3 votes shy of passing. Karen's face tightened into a mask, but behind her eyes burned something dangerous. She had tasted near victory, and that would only drive her harder. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, she cornered me by the door. "You think this was a win? All you did was prove how divided this place is. And divided neighborhoods collapse. Just wait, you'll be the one everyone blames." Her words echoed in my head as I walked home under the streetlights. She wasn't entirely wrong. Division was spreading, and once neighbors stop trusting each other, the fabric of a community can unravel fast. The question was, could she push it far enough to turn them all against me? The answer came sooner than I expected. A few nights later, long after dark, I was woken by the sound of grinding metal. I rushed outside with a flashlight and nearly dropped it when the beam landed on my tractor. The ignition had been tampered with, wires yanked loose, panels pried open. Someone had tried to hotwire it. The attempt had failed, but not before leaving deep gouges in the paint and scattering tools across the dirt. I knew instantly who was behind it. Not Karen herself, she was far too careful to dirty her hands, but one of her allies, emboldened by her constant drumbeat of paranoia. This was no longer about fines or flyers. This was sabotage. I called Harris, who arrived within the hour, his cruiser lights bathing the yard in red and blue. He examined the damage, collected the tools, and muttered, "This is felony territory now. Attempted theft, destruction of property. Whoever did this wasn't messing around." I looked over at the row of houses across the street, many of them dark, though I could swear I saw a curtain twitch shut. Karen's house stood at the end of the block, porch light glowing defiantly. She wanted a war? She was about to get one. But here's the thing. I wasn't going to fight her with rage or sabotage of my own. That would be her game, and she'd love nothing more than to paint me as the reckless aggressor. No, I was going to be patient, calm, strategic, because if Karen thought she could break me with signs, petitions, and midnight vandals, she hadn't yet learned the most important thing about me. I always play the long game. And the longer the game goes, the more spectacular the fall. I didn't expect the next escalation to come in broad daylight, but with Karen, nothing ever simmered quietly. The morning after the sabotage attempt, I was outside repairing my tractor's ignition panel when a convoy of shiny SUVs pulled into the cul-de-sac. They weren't neighbors this time. They were strangers in suits and clipboards, their shoes too clean for our gravel road. At the head of the pack, like a general unveiling reinforcements, was Karen. Her hair was coiffed into a perfect helmet, and she wore oversized sunglasses that made her look like she was about to declare war on the paparazzi. "These gentlemen," she announced loudly, gesturing to the strangers, "are from the County Property Standards Office. I filed a formal complaint, and they are here to investigate." I looked at the men in their tailored suits, then at the neighbors who were trickling onto their lawns to watch. "Well," I said, wiping grease from my hands onto a rag, "you'd better hope they enjoy tractors." The inspectors began their examination, measuring distances from the barn, peering at soil samples, and scribbling furiously on their clipboards. Karen trailed behind them like a tour guide narrating a crime scene. "This tractor has been idling for hours at a time," she lied, pumping exhaust into the air. "Children have reported dizziness, headaches, and feelings of unease." The inspectors didn't nod, didn't disagree, but I could tell they weren't buying her dramatics either. When they asked for access to my records, I handed them a neatly organized binder with every deed, permit, and zoning exemption inside. I'd anticipated this move the moment her petition failed. The lead inspector flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. After 10 minutes, he closed the binder and said, "Everything appears to be in order. No violations here." The crowd murmured. Karen's lips parted in disbelief. "No violations? What about the safety of our community?" The inspector adjusted his glasses and gave her a professional smile. "Ma'am, property lines and equipment use are clearly documented. Unless you can produce evidence of an actual hazard, our hands are tied." Karen's composure cracked for a split second. Then she whipped off her sunglasses and sneered, "Fine. Then I'll go higher." The inspectors left. The neighbors dispersed, many of them laughing quietly at Karen's theatrics. But I didn't laugh. Because her words weren't an empty threat. She had already gone higher once, dragging the zoning board into our feud. If she was escalating again, it meant she was willing to burn political capital just to make my life miserable. I didn't have to wait long to see what higher meant. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm representing the HOA. It claimed I was in breach of covenant and demanded immediate removal of my tractor or face a lawsuit for property value depreciation. It was absurd. They knew it was absurd. But absurdity has a way of forcing you to spend money and time defending yourself. I called Harris. He whistled when I read him the letter. "They're trying to bury you in paperwork," he said. "Don't take the bait. Respond through a lawyer, keep everything documented. If it goes to court, they don't have a case." I hired a lawyer, one who specialized in property disputes, and we filed a countersuit for harassment. That's when things shifted. Suddenly Karen wasn't just playing HOA queen, she was a defendant in a potential lawsuit. It should have scared her. Instead, it made her reckless. The next act of madness came during the HOA's 4th of July celebration. Every year, the association threw a block party with grills, games, and a rented bounce house. This year, Karen hijacked the microphone meant for the DJ. She climbed onto the stage in front of dozens of families and delivered what she clearly thought was a rousing speech. "Our neighborhood is under threat," she proclaimed, gesturing toward my property. "One man's selfishness is destroying our unity, our safety, and our future. He hides behind legal loopholes and technicalities, but we know the truth. He doesn't care about us. He cares only about his machine." People shifted uncomfortably. Some clapped, more out of habit than conviction. A few booed. I stayed seated in my folding chair, sipping lemonade, meeting her gaze calmly. She wanted me to snap, to rise and create a spectacle. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, when she finally wound down, I stood slowly and raised my cup. "To tractors," I said dryly. The crowd erupted in laughter, the tension breaking like a popped balloon. Karen's face twisted as though I'd slapped her. That moment, her speech turned into a punchline, was when I realized she was losing control. But people like Karen don't retreat gracefully. They lash out. And she did, in spectacular fashion. 2 nights later, floodlights blazed across my property at midnight. I ran outside to see a group of workers in reflective vests unloading construction equipment. They were pouring cement directly in front of my pasture gate, sealing off access to the tractor. At their head was Karen, barking orders like a foreman. "You're trespassing!" I shouted, striding toward them. "Stop right now!" Karen turned, her face illuminated in the harsh white light. "We're protecting the neighborhood. If you won't remove it, we'll make sure you can't use it." I yanked out my phone and dialed Harris. He arrived within minutes, sirens wailing, cruiser skidding to a stop. The workers froze. Karen, however, didn't budge. She planted her feet and screamed, This is community action. You can't stop us." Harris stepped out, his hand resting on his holster, not as a threat, but as a reminder of authority. "Ma'am, you're destroying private property. Shut it down now." The workers, clearly paid but not suicidal, shut off the cement mixer and began packing up. Karen howled in frustration, hurling accusations of corruption and favoritism. Harris warned her she was a breath away from arrest. She backed off eventually, but the damage was done. Half my driveway was smeared with wet cement, an ugly gray scar under the floodlights. I spent the next morning chiseling it away, neighbors stopping by to offer sympathy, or, in some cases, to shake their heads at all the drama. The line between her supporters and mine was sharper than ever now. She had crossed from nuisance into criminality, and some people were finally realizing it. But Karen wasn't finished. A week later, I received another letter, this one directly from her lawyer. It accused me of defamation for mocking her at the block party. Apparently, my detractors' toast had damaged her reputation. I nearly laughed until I cried. My lawyer assured me it was baseless, but it proved something. She wasn't fighting for the community anymore. She was fighting for herself, for her pride, for the image she thought she deserved. And that's when I made a decision. Until now I had played defense, calm, patient, strategic. But if she wanted to drag me through mud, maybe it was time she got her shoes dirty. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every flyer, every midnight stunt. I collected witness statements from neighbors who had seen her antics firsthand. I even installed cameras around the property, catching her late-night prowls when she thought no one was watching. Piece by piece, I was building a case not just to defend myself, but to expose her. Because sooner or later, she was going to push too far. And when she did, I wanted to be ready. That moment came faster than I expected. One humid August evening, while I was tightening a bolt on the tractor's frame, I noticed flashing lights reflecting off the barn. Not Harris's cruiser this time. An entire fleet. Multiple deputies swarming the street, neighbors spilling out of their homes in confusion. And at the center of it all stood Karen, screaming that I was running illegal farming operations, and demanding they arrest me on the spot. But Harris was there too, standing beside the deputies, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and disbelief. He turned to me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You know, I think the fastest way to end this nonsense is to prove once and for all what this tractor really is." Then he climbed onto the seat, revved the engine, and with the entire neighborhood watching, drove it straight through the flimsy wooden fence Karen had erected weeks earlier in her privacy stunt. Boards splintered, neighbors gasped, and Karen shrieked like the sky had fallen. And I just stood there, arms folded, watching her empire of control collapse one plank at a time. The war wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. Because now it wasn't just me against Karen. It was Karen against the truth. The night after Harris drove the tractor through Karen's so-called privacy fence, the neighborhood didn't sleep. Porch lights glowed long past midnight, curtains twitched, and voices carried in hushed tones across manicured lawns. Everyone knew the feud had reached a tipping point. But if anyone thought Karen would lick her wounds and retreat, they didn't know her the way I had come to. She wasn't humiliated into silence, she was humiliated into obsession. I realized this the next morning when I opened my mailbox and found it stuffed with glossy brochures. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but then I saw the bold title, "Protect Our Community, Vote Yes on the Tractor Ban." The pamphlet had been professionally designed, with stock photos of happy families, smiling children, and perfectly mowed lawns. My tractor, of course, was featured as the villain, shown in grainy, distorted photos like a monster hulking in the background of paradise. Karen hadn't just upped the game, she had gone corporate. By noon, the cul-de-sac was littered with the brochures. They were taped to doors, stuffed under windshield wipers, even slipped into the church bulletin that Sunday. Neighbors walked past me with tight smiles, clutching the leaflets like shields. It was brilliant propaganda, the kind that turned perception into reality by sheer repetition. I didn't panic. Instead, I quietly began my counteroffensive. I printed out a single sheet of paper, plain white, no colors, no graphic. At the top, in bold letters, I wrote, "Facts about the tractor." Below that, I listed the property deed dates, the agricultural exemption, and the sheriff's written statement that no laws were being broken. No dramatics, no propaganda. Just cold, hard documentation. I slipped copies into mailboxes myself, one by one, making sure to wave cheerfully to anyone watching. By sundown, the neighborhood had two competing stories in circulation. One painted me as a selfish monster. The other painted Karen as a liar. That same week, I noticed new behavior from her side. Cars I didn't recognize began idling near my driveway at odd hours, their occupants snapping photos. Strangers walked the sidewalk, pointing cameras at the tractor like they were documenting evidence for a trial. Karen had mobilized her allies into an amateur surveillance squad. It didn't take long for her to make the next move. One evening, I came home to find a notice pinned to my door with bright red tape. It declared that the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting to address persistent safety violations. The language was vague, but I knew what it meant. Karen was trying again to rally the board, only this time with glossy brochures and a new chorus of evidence. The meeting was packed. Standing room only. Karen strutted into the clubhouse like a general returning from battle, her arms loaded with binders. She slapped them onto the podium with dramatic flair and announced, "I have gathered overwhelming proof that the tractor must go. We cannot allow one individual to endanger our entire community." She clicked a remote, and a projector lit up the wall behind her. Slide after slide appeared, photos of my tractor taken at night, blurry images that looked sinister if you squinted hard enough. She even included a chart, cobbled together from who knows where, claiming property values in neighborhoods with visible farm equipment declined by 20%. The room buzzed with murmurs. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't bother with theatrics. I carried one folder to the podium and opened it calmly. "Every single image you've seen tonight was taken on private property without permission," I said. "Every chart was pulled from a blog, not an official record. Every claim about property values is speculation. What you're looking at isn't evidence. It's obsession." I laid down my trump card. Copies of the police report from the sabotage attempt, documenting that someone had tried to hotwire my tractor. "If we're going to talk about community safety," I continued, "maybe we should focus on the fact that someone was encouraged to commit a crime because of this smear campaign." The room went quiet. Karen tried to interject, but the board chair held up a hand. "We'll deliberate privately," he said. The meeting adjourned in tense silence. That night, as I walked back across the parking lot, Karen intercepted me. Her voice was low, venomous. "You think you're clever. But the longer this drags out, the more people will get tired of you. They'll want peace, and I'll be the one offering it." I smiled. "Peace at the cost of obedience isn't peace. It's surrender." Her eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." Then she turned on her heel and marched away. The following days proved her right, at least partially. The board released a statement saying they were reviewing evidence and consulting legal counsel. Translation: they weren't willing to stick their necks out yet. Meanwhile, neighbors grew more polarized. Some waved when I passed, whispering encouragement. Others turned away, unwilling to make eye contact. The community fabric was fraying, just as Karen predicted. But she underestimated one thing. People grow tired of drama faster than they grow tired of tractors. By the third week, whispers turned into grumbles. Not about me, but about her. Parents complained about constant HOA disruptions. Retirees muttered about legal fees being wasted. Even some of her allies started distancing themselves, uncomfortable with how personal her crusade had become. That's when she made her boldest play yet. Late one night, floodlights blazed again, and the roar of heavy equipment echoed across the cul-de-sac. I ran outside to see a tow truck reversing into my pasture. Karen stood beside it, clipboard in hand, shouting instructions. "You can't do this!" I yelled, sprinting toward them. "It's an unauthorized vehicle," she shouted back, her voice shrill with triumph. "We're impounding it." The driver looked uneasy, clearly caught between his paycheck and the flashing cruiser that pulled in behind him seconds later. Harris stepped out, face grim. "Turn that truck around," he ordered. Karen shrieked. "You can't stop us. This is HOA authority." Harris strode right up to her, his voice steady but sharp. "Ma'am, if this truck touches that tractor, it's theft. And if you continue interfering with his property, I'll have no choice but to arrest you." The silence that followed was electric. Neighbors stood in pajamas on their lawns, wide-eyed, waiting to see if she'd finally pushed too far. Karen's mouth opened and closed, fury shaking her frame. Finally, she snapped at the driver. "Go!" The tow truck lurched forward, away from my property, leaving Karen trembling with rage. Harris lingered, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I strongly suggest you end this feud before you end up with charges that stick." Then he turned to me and muttered quietly, "She's spiraling. Keep your guard up." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves. Karen stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. For the first time since this began, I sensed the tide turning. Her desperation was obvious, her credibility shredded. But obsession has a way of burning hottest before it dies out. I knew she wasn't finished. She'd lost the petition, lost the inspectors, lost the tow truck stunt. Each loss only made her more dangerous. Suburb and more like a divided frontier town. On one side, you had the weary majority, families who just wanted to grill burgers on the weekend without hearing about tractor safety. On the other side, you had Karen's dwindling but vocal followers, clinging to her campaign as though it were a holy mission. And in the middle, there was me, leaning on the tractor more often than I actually drove it, a symbol of stubborn defiance whether I liked it or not. I could feel the tension whenever I walked my dog. Conversations hushed, glances darted, smiles froze. Kids whispered questions like, "Is he the tractor guy?" as if I were some outlaw legend. I almost found it amusing, except for the fact that Karen wasn't finished. Every quiet day was just a prelude to her next escalation. It came, predictably, on a Sunday morning. I was drinking coffee on the porch when a convoy of black sedans rolled into the cul-de-sac. Out stepped a man in a suit so stiff it could have been bulletproof, followed by a pair of assistants carrying binders. Karen appeared seconds later, beaming with pride. She had apparently convinced an actual attorney, her personal hire this time, not the HOA's, to come issue what she grandly called a cease and desist order. She strutted across my lawn, the attorney in tow, and proclaimed, "As of today, you are legally compelled to remove the tractor within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate litigation and seizure of property." She delivered the line like a villain in a soap opera, pausing for dramatic effect. The attorney cleared his throat, less theatrical but no less pompous, and handed me a thick envelope. I opened it slowly, skimming the legal jargon. Half the citations were irrelevant, the rest completely misapplied. It was a scare tactic dressed up in legalese, nothing more. I folded the papers neatly and said, "Thanks. I'll use these to start my fireplace tonight." Karen gasped, clutching her pearls like I'd just confessed to treason. "You think this is a game? You're finished. When this goes to court, you'll lose everything." But the attorney looked less certain. He gave Karen a side glance, muttered something about ongoing costs, and excused himself back to the sedan. Karen was left sputtering, holding the echo of her threat like a balloon with no air. That night, Harris called me. "Word's getting around at the station," he said. "Karen's been harassing not just you, but half the county offices with complaints. Building inspectors, fire marshals, animal control, she's filed something with all of them." "Let me guess," I said. "She thinks the tractor is a fire hazard, A health hazard, and maybe a weapon of mass destruction? Pretty much, Harris chuckled. Don't worry. Everyone's catching on. She's burying herself in paperwork faster than she's burying you. I hung up, reassured but cautious. Because when obsession reaches this level, logic doesn't matter. Desperation does. Sure enough, the next strike was theatrical in the extreme. One humid evening, just as the sun dipped low and the cicadas began their chorus, Karen staged what she clearly thought was her masterpiece. I heard shouting and stepped outside to find a full protest on my lawn. A dozen people, most of them recruited teenagers from who knows where, held signs scrawled with slogans like "Tractors Kill Communities" and "Save Our Children." Karen stood at the center, megaphone in hand, leading chants as though she'd organized a political movement. I couldn't help myself. I leaned against the tractor, arms crossed, and said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "Karen, do they know you're paying them $10 an hour?" The chanting faltered. The kids glanced at each other, embarrassed. Karen screeched into the megaphone, "Lies! He's trying to discredit our cause." But the damage was done. Within 20 minutes, the protesters trickled away, grumbling about gas money. Karen was left standing alone with her sign, the image of futility. That should have ended it. Any reasonable person would have recognized they'd become a punchline. But Karen wasn't reasonable. She retreated into her house, silent for days, and that's what made me nervous. Silence meant she was planning. Her next move wasn't just bold. It was dangerous. On a sticky August night, just past midnight, I was jolted awake by a deep mechanical rumble. At first I thought it was thunder. Then I realized it was too steady, too close. I pulled on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and sprinted outside. What I saw froze me. Karen had hired another tow truck. This one bigger, industrial grade, the kind meant for semis. Its headlights blazed across my pasture, illuminating the tractor hooked up and ready to be hauled. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, face triumphant. "This is the end," she shouted over the roar of the engine. "No more games. Say goodbye to your toy." I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply pulled out my phone and dialed Harris. The driver hesitated, sensing trouble. And trouble arrived fast. Within 5 minutes, multiple cruisers screamed into the cul-de-sac, red and blue lights splashing across Karen's house. Neighbors spilled out in pajamas, filming with their phones. Harris stepped out, looking more exhausted than angry this time. "Ma'am," he said, "you were warned. You're trespassing. You're attempting grand theft. And you're officially under arrest." The gasp that rippled through the crowd was like a wave crashing. Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She sputtered excuses. "This is HOA authority. I was protecting the neighborhood. You can't arrest me for doing my duty." But Harris was unmoved. 2 deputies cuffed her gently but firmly. Cameras captured every second. For the first time in this endless feud, Karen wasn't directing the show. She was the show. As they guided her into the cruiser, she twisted her neck to glare at me, eyes burning with fury. "You'll pay for this," she hissed. "They'll all see you're the problem, not me." But no one looked convinced. Neighbors whispered, some shook their heads, others openly laughed. Karen, once the self-appointed queen of order, was now the spectacle of chaos. When the cruiser pulled away, the cul-de-sac erupted into chatter. A few came over to pat me on the back, offering congratulations. Others just looked relieved, as though a storm had finally broken. I didn't celebrate. I knew this wasn't the end. Arrests don't always mean defeat for people like Karen. Sometimes they double down, casting themselves as martyrs. And sure enough, within 24 hours, her allies were spinning the story. Online posts popped up on neighborhood forums, painting her as a victim of corruption, of favoritism, of an unjust system protecting a reckless landowner. Some bought it. Most didn't. But the noise was there, simmering, waiting. I sat on the porch that night, watching the tractor under the floodlight, listening to crickets. The battle wasn't finished, but the balance had shifted. Karen had crossed the line from nuisance into criminality, and everyone had seen it. Still, I knew better than to relax. People like her don't crumble in one blow. They fray, strand by strand, until something finally snapped. And as the cicadas droned, I realized something chilling. If she couldn't destroy me legally, socially, or politically, she might turn to something worse. And when that moment came, I had to be ready. Divided, it was electrified. Karen's arrest had turned her from HOA tyrant to local legend in her own mind. For most of us, it was proof she'd lost her grip. For her, it was proof she was being persecuted. She had tasted handcuffs, spent a night at the county jail, and somehow convinced herself that she was now a martyr to the cause of community order. And like any good martyr, she came back more determined than ever. I'll never forget the morning I first saw the banner. Strung across the entrance to the subdivision, right under the Welcome to Oak Haven sign, hung a sheet with words spray-painted in blocky red letters. Tractor Terror Must End. It flapped in the breeze like a war flag, visible to every car driving in. Karen was reclaiming the narrative, daring me to respond. Neighbors buzzed about it all day. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but others looked uneasy. The banner was just absurd enough to plant seeds of doubt again. I ignored it outwardly, but inside I knew this was Karen's last stand. When people like her run out of legal tricks, they turn to pure theater. And theater always ends with a climax. The climax came faster than I expected. On a sweltering Saturday afternoon, I was fixing the pasture fence when I noticed unusual traffic building at the end of the street. Cars were parking on curbs, people piling out with lawn chairs, phones, even coolers. At first I thought there was a garage sale or maybe a block party. Then I saw Karen standing on her porch in full regalia, a wide-brimmed hat, pearls, and, no joke, a whistle around her neck like she was officiating a championship game. She blew it once, and her small crowd turned toward my property. "Today," she shouted, her voice amplified through a borrowed megaphone, "we reclaim our neighborhood." The crowd cheered, more out of amusement than conviction, but the sound echoed across the cul-de-sac. Karen pointed dramatically at the tractor and declared, "That machine is a menace. It ends now." I leaned on the fence, calm, letting the absurdity roll over me. But when I saw two men from her group moving toward the pasture with bolt cutters, I knew this wasn't just bluster. She was staging a spectacle, and if I didn't act, they'd drag the tractor into the street and make it a circus. I dialed Harris, quick and quiet. "You'd better get out here," I said. "Karen's throwing a rodeo." Within minutes, the sheriff's convoy arrived, 3 cruisers this time, sirens cutting through the summer air. Neighbors gasped, phones lifted, recordings began. The deputies stepped out, hands on belts, scanning the crowd. Harris was last, moving slow, deliberate, with the kind of authority that made people stop mid-chant. "Ma'am," he called, "this ends now." Karen stepped forward, megaphone in hand. "This is community action. We are protecting ourselves from a danger the law refuses to address." Harris didn't flinch. "You are inciting trespass, vandalism, and potentially theft. Put down the megaphone." The crowd murmured. Some began drifting back, realizing they'd signed up for entertainment, not handcuffed. But Karen wasn't backing down. Her face was red, her hair trembling with every shake of her head. "You're all blind. This man is a parasite. He's destroying what we built. If you won't enforce the rules, we will." And then, as if fate wanted to script the perfect finale, one of her volunteers panicked. He grabbed the tractor's gearshift, trying to move it himself. The engine coughed to life, gears grinding, the massive wheels lurching forward. The crowd screamed and scattered. The tractor rolled straight into the flimsy barrier of wood Karen had ordered built months earlier and demolished what was left of it in one crunching sweep. The sight was chaos and comedy in equal measure. Karen's own evidence fence splintering into toothpicks under the weight of the very machine she'd obsessed over. She shrieked into her megaphone, "Stop it! Stop it!" as though commanding the tractor itself. Harris and 2 deputies pulled the volunteer off, cuffing him on the spot. The crowd erupted, some laughing, some shouting, phones capturing every second. And through it all, I stood with arms crossed, calm as ever, watching the scene unravel like a play I'd already read the script to. Karen, however, wasn't done. She tried to rally what was left of her followers, shrieking about injustice, corruption, and betrayal. But her voice cracked, her words drowned out by laughter and the flashing of camera phones. The neighborhood wasn't divided anymore. It was united against her. When Harris finally approached her, handcuffs ready, she dropped the megaphone and collapsed onto her knees, wailing like a child denied dessert. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I was saving us. I was saving everything. But no one bought it anymore." Her theatrics, once intimidating, were now pathetic. Neighbors shook their heads, turned away, and muttered about how far it had gone. She was led into the cruiser again, the crowd dispersing with a mix of relief and disbelief. That night, the cul-de-sac was quiet for the first time in months. No protests, no floodlights, no shouting matches. Just crickets and the occasional hum of my tractor cooling in the barn. It felt almost unnatural, the sudden silence after so much chaos. In the weeks that followed, the HOA distanced itself from her entirely. The board released a formal apology, claiming they had been misled by misinformation. Karen's allies dwindled to none, her house growing dark and silent. Rumor had it her husband finally had enough and moved out. Some said she was selling, others that she was staying but under observation. I didn't care which. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to everyone again. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't parade the tractor down the street or hang banners of my own. I just kept living the same way I always had, fixing fences, mowing grass, sipping coffee on the porch. If neighbors stopped by to thank me for standing my ground, I accepted it with a nod. If others avoided the topic entirely, I let them. I wasn't interested in victory laps. One evening, Harris stopped by, leaning against the fence with that half-smile he always wore. "You know," he said, "you could have lost your mind a dozen times during all this. Most people would have snapped. But you kept your cool." I shrugged. "Karen wanted me to blow up. If I had, she'd have one." He nodded. "Well, you outlasted her. And sometimes that's all it takes." We stood in silence for a while, listening to the hum of cicadas, the lowing of cows in the distance. For the first time in months, the air felt clean. The tractor sat quietly under the barn lights, a hulking silhouette that had somehow become the center of a neighborhood war. To me, it was just a machine, useful, dependable, unassuming. But to Karen, it had been the embodiment of defiance, the thing she couldn't bend to her will. And in trying to break me, she had only broken herself. Looking back, that was the lesson. The tractor hadn't changed. The neighbors hadn't changed. What had changed was how far one person was willing to go to control others, and how much a community can endure before it finally says enough.